How low can you go? Can you go down low? How low can you go, Indiana Fever? Jeez, you guys have just turned this organization into a flat out joke. All of a sudden, Sophie Cunningham is hurt. All of a sudden, her elbow's messed up. Y'all smell that? Smells like BS. It smells like some punishment is being served out to Sophie Cunningham for going rogue. This is ridiculous. Look at the first comment, Evelyn. You guys are a clown organization. Here it says, Sophie hurt her elbow writing this for Stephanie White, didn't she? This is what Sophie Cunningham has. I will not pass to Caitlin again. I will not pass to Caitlin Clark again. This is what they forced Sophie Cunningham to do. Okay, that's how she hurt her elbow. CDS Sports, go rogue, win game, end up on injury report. Beatings will continue until morale improves. This is ridiculous, guys. This is ridiculous. Everybody knows this is clearly punishment for Sophie Cunningham. Chloe Peterson was the first to report on it. She said, Sophie Cunningham is questionable with the right elbow injury for tomorrow's game. She participated in the portion of practice open to the media this morning. Okay. And everybody knows the whole every comment is that this is punishment. Look here, Sophie being put in timeout for speaking what's on her mind. Okay, this organization is like the mafia, so everyone knows it's clear as day that this is punishment for Sophie Cunningham. It's very, very, very obvious that this is punishment for Sophie Cunningham. The organization is a straight up clown show at this point. And then not only that, they have not addressed the smear campaign. They've gone out of their way to address any and everything else. They refuse to address the smear campaign led by Dan Dockich, who has been adamant about he's getting this information from the inside. Not only have they not addressed that, and he doubled down on it today. Dan Dockich was bombing again today. Stephanie White went on the same platform that took shots at Caitlin Clark and aired a hit piece. This is crazy. All of this is just flat out craziness. This Indiana Fever organization is a flat out joke. Sophie Cunningham is being punished for going rogue with Caitlin Clark, passing her the ball. You know they wanted that ball to go to Kelsey Mitchell. They didn't give a damn. They didn't give a damn. That ball go to Kelsey Mitchell or come hell or high water. And that is what it is.
Something is broken inside the Indiana Fever organization, and what's happening behind closed doors could reshape the entire WNBA. This isn't about wins, losses, or statistics anymore. Reports are circulating that reveal a devastating choice: loyalty to a teammate or obedience to authority. One decision, one moment. And now the biggest star in women's basketball might be prepared to walk away from everything. The packed arenas, the historic numbers, the season that was supposed to change women's sports forever, all of it potentially gone because of what allegedly happened in a private office at the Fever's practice facility. Before you dismiss this as drama, understand what's really at stake. The commissioner's office is reportedly in emergency mode. League officials are scrambling. And the person who could trigger it all is the last person anyone expected to become the center of this storm. If you've been following the Fever this season, you know something feels different lately. There's tension, there's distance, and now you're about to understand exactly why. Stay until the end because this story involves betrayal, sacrifice, and one athlete's decision to risk everything for the teammate who protected her. This is the untold story of what allegedly happened inside Indiana. When Caitlin Clark stepped into the WNBA, everyone immediately understood one thing: she would be hunted, not metaphorically. Literally hunted on every court, every single night. Veterans who had been in the league for years saw a young superstar entering their space, commanding attention, drawing fans, changing the narrative around women's basketball. And they responded the way experienced players often do when threatened, with physicality, with aggressive defense schemes designed specifically to punish her, with hard contact meant to remind her that this league doesn't welcome outsiders without a price. Opposing teams designed entire defensive strategies around stopping Clark. They studied film. They coordinated efforts. They understood that if they could make her uncomfortable physically, they might disrupt the rhythm that made her so dangerous. She took elbows she shouldn't have taken. She absorbed contact that went uncalled. She faced crowds screaming at her in hostile arenas, Portland, Chicago, other cities where opposing fans treated her like an invader who didn't belong. But here's what made the difference between Clark surviving that pressure and Clark thriving despite it: Sophie Cunningham. From the earliest moments of the season, Cunningham positioned herself as something more than a teammate. She became a protector. Whenever an opponent delivered a questionable hit, Sophie was there. When someone tried to intimidate Clark through physicality, Cunningham stepped in. She accepted technical fouls without hesitation. She endured criticism. She faced hostility from opposing crowds with the same intensity she showed defending Clark on the court. To much of the league, Sophie became the villain, the aggressive, emotional enforcer, willing to cross lines to protect her star. But inside the Fever locker room, something deeper was developing. This wasn't just professional respect or team chemistry. This was the kind of bond that forms when one player repeatedly puts her body and reputation on the line for another. Every time Sophie absorbed a hit meant for Clark, every time she stepped forward when an opponent tried to intimidate the franchise star, every time she accepted punishment or criticism to shield her teammate, the connection between them deepened. Clark understood what was happening. She recognized that Sophie was sacrificing her own image, her own opportunities, her own comfort to create space for the star player to perform. In return, Clark depended on that protection. She trusted Cunningham in a way that transcended normal teammate relationships. Sophie became the person Clark knew would always have her back, would always respond, would always be there when things got physical or hostile. Other players noticed it. Coaches noticed it. League observers noticed it. There was an unspoken understanding that these two had something special, a loyalty that didn't need words because it was demonstrated through action every single game. Sophie would rush to Clark's defense. Clark would make eye contact with her protector, acknowledge her, show gratitude through small gestures and trust. It created an emotional dynamic that elevated both of them. Sophie's aggressive style, her emotional intensity, her willingness to take on physical and emotional labor that others wouldn't touch, these qualities that might have been liabilities on another team became invaluable in Indiana. Clark needed someone like that, and Cunningham had found purpose in that role. She had become essential not just to the team's strategy, but to Clark's ability to perform at an elite level. The fans saw it too. Social media filled with appreciation for Cunningham's loyalty. People understood that Clark's historic season wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening because someone was willing to clear a path, absorb hits, face criticism, and protect the star no matter the personal cost. Sophie wasn't seeking attention for it. She wasn't posting about it or demanding recognition. She simply did it because it mattered to her, because protecting Clark mattered. This bond had become the emotional foundation of Indiana's entire season. It wasn't just basketball. It was about loyalty in a league where loyalty is rare. It was about sacrifice in a world where players are often expected to prioritize themselves. It was about trust that had been built through hundreds of moments where one player chose to stand beside another, even when it cost her.
Ridiculous. Isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious that Dan Dockich is not lying about the information he's getting from within this organization as they refuse to address it? Dan Dockich doubled down on everything he said right here in this. He took the X. Yo, G, damn it, hold on. Steph White is Steph White is calling. Gotta go to work. Keep hating. Keep stalking. So he's taking shots at the people that have been addressing him, adding on to the smear campaign that's going on against Caitlin Clark. It's ridiculous, but the fact of the matter is you can't blame Dan Dockich. You can't blame him. He's not lying about where he's getting the information from, which is why the Indiana Fever is so hush and damn quiet about it. He's not lying. None of them are going to come out and call him a liar. None of them have stepped up to the plate to address the smear campaign that's being launched at Caitlin Clark. She's being targeted. They're not saying anything because it's coming from them. They've gone on to address everything else, whether it's people coming at them for the draft. Lynn Dunn went and called us all complainers. Stephanie White addressing the fans saying, hey, these games are boring as hell now. These games are boring. The product stinks now. You've come over here and ruined the product. The games are entertaining. She addressed that in last game's pregame podium. They've addressed everything. The Indiana Fever's Twitter handle or X handle put a post up after last game saying, are you not entertained? They've been addressing everything publicly but this, because they are in on it. Make no mistake about that. Make no mistake about that at all. And then Stephanie White, shout out to Mick Talks Hoops.
This is gross.
Well, we see Cheryl Reeve wearing a shirt today in support of trans kids. Trans kids belong on the shirt. And this in the aftermath of Sophie Cunningham's recent comments. We actually saw Cheryl and Sophie speaking at center court pregame. And yesterday, Cheryl Reeve spent a lot of time talking at length with the media about this topic.
Easy to find online.
I would encourage anybody to go see Cheryl Reeve's comments. By the way, Sophie did not look like she backed down from Cheryl Reeve. I've got more coming on all of this. This is right here. Sophie Cunningham, by the way, took a ugly elbow in this game, and the refs called the foul against her. Let's just look at this. Bam! Hit her right in the jaw. And the refs, they swallowed their whistles. I'd love to know why. Lynx defeated the Fever 108-100. And you could see the deficiencies in this team showed out. The bench is not deep enough. There's not enough length on this team. Again, we were saying that as free agency was going on. And then the draft, when it really blew up, and they took Raven Johnson instead of a big. And they got rid of Justine Passat. It felt like the Fever never had a chance in this game. And I was looking at the starting five for the Lynx. We got to realize.
But the coaching staff was watching this dynamic develop, and not everyone saw it the way the fans did. Not everyone viewed Sophie's protectiveness as an asset. Some saw it as a problem. Some saw it as emotional, uncontrolled, and potentially threatening to the structure and discipline that a championship-caliber team needed to maintain. What happened next would expose a fundamental conflict between two different visions of what the Fever should be. One vision prioritized loyalty and protection. The other prioritized control and organizational authority, and neither side was prepared to compromise. The bond between Clark and Cunningham had become so powerful that it was now creating tension in the places where power actually lived. In the coaching staff offices, in the front office, in the minds of people who believed that players should follow instructions without question, regardless of personal relationships or unspoken agreements. This loyalty that everyone had celebrated would soon become the reason for one of the most devastating decisions in recent Fever history. But before that happened, the organization made a critical miscalculation. They believed they could separate these two players without consequences. They believed they could punish Cunningham quietly and that Clark would simply accept it, move on, and continue performing. They didn't understand just how deep this connection had become. And what happened next would prove them catastrophically wrong. Behind the scenes, where cameras don't reach and fans can't see, a very different narrative was allegedly developing inside the Fever organization. While everyone on the outside was celebrating Sophie Cunningham's loyalty and emotional investment in protecting Caitlin Clark, the coaching staff was becoming increasingly concerned about what they viewed as a growing problem. According to reports that have surfaced, Stephanie White and her coaching team had begun to perceive Sophie's behavior not as protection, but as something far more problematic, a loss of control. They worried that Cunningham's emotional intensity, her willingness to take technical fouls, her aggressive approach to defending Clark, and her overall unpredictability were creating more problems than they were solving. What fans saw as loyalty, the coaching staff allegedly saw as insubordination dressed up as team spirit. Coaches operate under a specific framework. They design plays. They establish systems. They expect players to execute those systems within defined parameters. They want discipline, structure, and most importantly, authority. When a player, any player, begins making independent decisions based on personal relationships rather than team strategy, it creates what coaches view as chaos. And from the coaching staff's perspective, that's exactly what Sophie was doing. Reports suggest that White believed Cunningham's behavior had become uncontrollable. She was taking technical fouls that could harm the team's performance in crucial moments. She was engaged in emotional reactions on the court that distracted from the team's offensive and defensive schemes. She was prioritizing her personal bond with Clark over the larger strategic goals that the coaching staff had established. From a coaching perspective, this represented a fundamental breakdown in the hierarchical structure that any professional team requires to function. What made this more complicated was that Sophie's aggression and emotional responses were directed at protecting Clark, but protection wasn't in the coaching staff's game plan. The coaching staff had systems. They had strategies for how Clark should be defended, how the team should respond to physical play, how conflicts should be managed. Sophie's independent protective actions, no matter how well-intentioned, were circumventing those systems. She was deciding for herself when to intervene, when to take a technical foul, when to step forward. She was, in essence, playing coach on the court. The coaching staff also had concerns about the message this was sending to the rest of the roster. If Sophie Cunningham could prioritize her personal relationship with Clark over team structure and get away with it, what message did that send to other players? What was to stop them from beginning to make their own independent decisions based on personal loyalties rather than coaching instructions? In the coaching staff's view, allowing this behavior to continue would eventually undermine the entire organizational structure. There were also whispers, according to reports, that some members of the coaching staff felt threatened by the power dynamic that had developed between Clark and Cunningham. If Clark had a person on the court who she trusted completely, who would respond to her needs without question, who would protect her loyalties over team strategy, didn't that create a situation where the star player had too much influence? Wasn't that a challenge to the coaching staff's authority? Reports suggest that conversations began happening in private meetings. Coaches discussed the Sophie problem. They debated whether her behavior was sustainable. They questioned whether allowing her loyalty to Clark to drive her decision-making was ultimately healthy for the team or harmful. Some allegedly argued that Cunningham's emotional intensity needed to be channeled into more controlled outlets. Others suggested that she needed to be reminded of the hierarchy, that she was a role player, not the emotional center of the franchise. The coaching staff's perspective also included a view of organizational image. To them, Sophie's constant emotional reactions and aggressive responses made the team look volatile, unpredictable, and poorly coached. A well-coached team, in their view, responds to adversity with composure. Players follow the system. They don't freelance. They don't make emotional decisions. They execute the plan. Sophie's willingness to take technical fouls, to respond aggressively to perceived slights against Clark, to operate outside the structure. All of this suggested to the coaching staff that they had lost control of their roster. What's particularly important to understand is that the coaching staff's concerns weren't entirely unreasonable from a basketball perspective. Teams do need discipline. Systems do matter. Coaches do need authority. The problem wasn't that Stephanie White wanted structure and organization. The problem was that the structure and organization she wanted came directly into conflict with the emotional and relational foundation that had made the Fever special in the first place. Reports claim that conversations intensified. The coaching staff made a decision. Sophie Cunningham's behavior needed to be corrected. She needed to be reminded that the team came first, that coaching authority was absolute, and that personal relationships, no matter how meaningful, couldn't supersede organizational discipline. Someone needed to make an example. Someone needed to demonstrate that the coaching staff was in control, not individual players, no matter how loyal or well-intentioned. What nobody anticipated was how Clark would react when she discovered what had been decided. The coaching staff believed they were addressing a discipline problem. They didn't realize they were about to trigger something far more dangerous. The fury of a player who understood exactly what loyalty meant and who had decided she would never abandon the teammate who had protected her. The morning started like any other morning at the Fever's practice facility, except it wasn't. According to accounts that have emerged, the atmosphere was different. There was a coldness in the air before most players even arrived. Staff members moved with unusual tension. People who worked in the building noticed that something significant was about to happen, but nobody was saying what. Stephanie White had made her decision. Sophie Cunningham needed to be suspended. Not because of a specific incident, not because of a single game or performance issue, but because of her overall approach, her emotional intensity, her prioritization of loyalty over structure. The suspension would be indefinite. It would send a message. It would demonstrate authority. It would remind the entire roster that nobody, not even a beloved defensive presence, was above organizational discipline. But the coaching staff and front office had made a critical decision about how to handle this publicly. They couldn't tell the truth. They couldn't say that Sophie was being suspended for being too loyal, too protective, too emotionally connected to Clark. That would create immediate backlash. It would look like the organization was punishing a player for defending the franchise star. So they decided on a cover story. Sophie would be absent due to a personal issue. That's what would be told to the media. That's what would be released in official statements. The real reason, discipline, control, a message about organizational authority would be hidden. On that cold morning, White summoned Cunningham to a private meeting in the front office. There was no advanced warning. There were no teammates present. There was no opportunity for Sophie to prepare herself mentally or emotionally for what she was about to hear. She walked into that office with no idea that her season, her role, her presence with the team was about to be taken away. The conversation was described as clinical and brief. White allegedly told Cunningham that her conduct was damaging the image and focus of the team, her emotional reactions, her aggressive defense, her tendency to prioritize protecting Clark over the team's larger structure. All of it was creating problems. All of it needed to stop. And the way to stop it was through suspension. According to emotional accounts that emerged later, Sophie allegedly asked questions. She wanted to understand exactly what behavior had triggered this. She wanted to know if there was any path back, any way to demonstrate that she understood the coaching staff's concerns. She wanted clarity on a timeline. But White allegedly gave her few answers. The decision had been made. The suspension was indefinite. She needed to gather her belongings and leave. Reports described Sophie's reaction as shock followed by heartbreak. She had sacrificed. She had put her body on the line. She had accepted criticism. She had stood beside Clark through every hostile crowd, every physical challenge, every difficult moment. And now she was being punished for it. Not rewarded, not appreciated. Punished. She left that office and walked through the facility toward her locker. According to witnesses, tears were forming in her eyes, but she didn't lose composure. She didn't create a scene. She didn't go tell other players what had happened or demand to speak with front office leadership. She simply accepted the punishment the way she had accepted everything else in her career, with quiet dignity and without complaint. She began removing her belongings from the locker that had represented her place on this team. What made this even more devastating was the privacy of it all. Sophie wasn't being benched in a public way. She wasn't being told she was getting limited minutes. This was a quiet removal. This was a disappearance. The organization had decided to handle this in a way that would minimize immediate public outrage by creating a false narrative. Sophie would be gone, but nobody would know the real reason why. Reports claim she left before other players arrived at the facility. She gathered her things. She walked out. And she allegedly carried with her the understanding that the organization she had fought for, the teammate she had protected, the team she had sacrificed her reputation to defend, they might never know the real reason she disappeared. The cover story about personal issues would circulate. People would speculate. But the truth about why she was really being suspended would remain hidden. Think about what that feels like. Imagine dedicating yourself to protecting a teammate. Imagine absorbing hits meant for them. Imagine accepting criticism and technical fouls and hostile crowds because you believed it mattered. Imagine sacrificing your comfort and your reputation for someone else's success. And then imagine being quietly removed and told to leave while your organization spreads a false explanation about why you're gone. This was calculated. This was cold. This was organizational discipline expressed through isolation and secrecy. The Fever leadership believed they were reasserting control. They believed they were sending a message about organizational authority. They believed they were protecting the team's structure and focus. What they didn't anticipate was that one person would walk through those facility doors after Sophie left. One person would notice that her locker had been emptied. One person would understand immediately what had really happened. And one person would decide that loyalty meant something different than what the coaching staff understood it to mean. That person was Caitlin Clark, and what happened next would change everything. Caitlin Clark arrived at the practice facility like she did every other day. She was the franchise star, the biggest name in women's basketball, the player whose arrival had transformed the WNBA's entire landscape. She walked through those doors expecting a normal day. She expected to see Sophie Cunningham. She expected her protector, her defender, her teammate, to be there doing what she always did. Instead, she found an empty locker. According to reports, a locker room employee quietly explained what had happened. Sophie had been suspended. Her things had been removed. She was gone. The employee didn't know why exactly. There was a story about personal issues, but nobody seemed certain about the details. Clark's reaction was not subtle. It was not the kind of disappointment that a player shows when a teammate gets injured. This was something different. Reports describe what happened next as a combination of heartbreak, anger, and immediate understanding. Clark didn't need an explanation beyond what she was seeing. She understood exactly what had really occurred. The coaching staff had suspended Sophie. They had removed her. They had decided that loyalty was a problem that needed to be fixed. And in that moment, Clark realized what her protector had been sacrificed for: organizational control. She didn't put on her shoes. She didn't head to the practice court. She didn't speak with other teammates or ask questions about the details. She didn't try to process this quietly or privately. Instead, she made an immediate decision. This needed to be addressed right now. This couldn't wait for later conversations or internal discussions. This was happening immediately. Clark walked directly towards Stephanie White's office. According to accounts, people in the hallway could sense something was wrong. The MVP candidate was moving with a level of fury that nobody had witnessed before. This wasn't typical frustration or game day intensity. This was something deeper. This was betrayal. When Clark opened that office door, people standing in the hallway allegedly heard one of the most emotional confrontations the organization had ever experienced. Clark didn't begin with pleasantries or questions about organizational structure. She dove directly into what mattered. She reminded White of everything Sophie had done. She talked about every hit Cunningham had absorbed that was meant for her. She talked about every time Sophie had stepped forward when opponents tried to intimidate her. She talked about the technical fouls, the criticism, the hostile crowds, all of it absorbed by Cunningham without complaint. She made it clear that she understood the sacrifice. She understood the cost. And she understood that the coaching staff had decided that cost was a problem. Reports claim that Clark's voice carried an intensity that reflected not anger but conviction. She wasn't yelling in an uncontrolled way. She was speaking with the clarity of someone who had just made a decision and was now communicating it. She would not quietly accept this. She would not move forward as if nothing had happened. She would not continue playing basketball for an organization that would betray the teammate who had protected her. White allegedly tried to explain that the suspension came from organizational leadership, that it was intended to restore focus and control, that it was necessary for the team's structure. But Clark supposedly rejected every explanation. She didn't accept the reasoning. She didn't acknowledge the coaching staff's perspective. She simply refused. And then she made a decision that would reshape everything. According to the leaked account that emerged, Clark leaned across the desk. She made direct eye contact with her coach, and she delivered a sentence that had the potential to shake the entire WNBA. If Cunningham was forced out, if Sophie's suspension remained in place, if the organization continued down this path, Clark would leave too. She would refuse to remain. She would not take the court. She would not continue her season. She would walk away alongside the teammate who had protected her. This wasn't a threat made in anger. This was a statement of fact. This was Clark communicating her actual decision. She had chosen loyalty over everything else, over her historic season, over her achievements, over her potential records and accolades. If Sophie went, Clark went too. The impact of that ultimatum was reportedly immediate and severe. Word of the confrontation reached league officials within minutes. The WNBA commissioner's office went into emergency mode. Executives realized that the biggest star in women's basketball, the player whose presence had transformed the entire league's trajectory, might actually be prepared to walk away from the season in protest. This was no longer about basketball. This was no longer about coaching decisions or team discipline. This had become a crisis that threatened the fundamental stability of the entire league. Because if Clark walked away, if she refused to play, the consequences would ripple across every aspect of women's basketball. Nobody had anticipated this. The coaching staff believed they were making a standard organizational decision. They believed they were enforcing discipline. They didn't understand that they were about to trigger something far more powerful. The decision of a superstar athlete to stand beside the teammate who had sacrificed everything for her, no matter what it cost. The moment the commissioner's office learned about Clark's ultimatum, panic set in. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was a genuine threat from the league's most valuable asset, the player who had single-handedly transformed women's basketball's landscape. And the stakes became immediately and undeniably clear. The WNBA had experienced unprecedented growth this season. Packed arenas that had previously struggled to sell tickets were now full. Television audiences were rising in numbers that league officials had never imagined possible. Merchandise was flying off shelves. Corporate sponsorships that had previously shown little interest in women's basketball were suddenly competing for partnerships. All of this growth, all of this attention, all of this transformation, it was directly connected to one player, Caitlin Clark. Millions of viewers were tuning in specifically to watch her play. Social media engagement had exploded. Media coverage had expanded exponentially. Teams that had previously received minimal attention were suddenly national stories because Clark played for them. The Indiana Fever had transformed from a struggling franchise into a must-watch organization. Stadium capacity, merchandise sales, television ratings, social media engagement, everything was tied to Clark's presence on the court. League officials understood, with brutal clarity, what would happen if Clark refused to play. If she walked away in protest, even for a few games, the damage could be catastrophic. Conservative projections suggested that nearly half of the WNBA's current audience could lose interest. These weren't casual fans who would stick around watching other teams. These were Clark loyalists who had discovered women's basketball specifically because of her. If Clark disappeared, they would likely disappear too. The financial implications were staggering. Television contracts depended on viewership numbers. Sponsorship deals were built around engagement metrics that were directly tied to Clark's presence. Arena attendance projections, merchandise forecasts, corporate partnerships, all of it was calibrated around the assumption that Clark would continue playing. If that assumption changed, the financial foundation of the league's recent growth would collapse. And that's not even considering what would happen to the Indiana Fever specifically. The franchise had become one of the most valuable organizations in the league because of Clark. If she walked away, the Fever would return to being a struggling franchise in a secondary market. Years of rebuilding would be undone. The investment in the franchise, the hope for the future, the entire strategic direction would be compromised. Reports claimed the commissioner was furious that Stephanie White and the Fever organization had allowed the disagreement with Cunningham to reach such a dangerous point. How had internal team dynamics escalated to a point where the league's biggest star was threatening to abandon the season? How had a coaching decision about discipline created a crisis of this magnitude? Emergency discussions were allegedly convened. League officials, Front office representatives, legal teams, and public relations experts were brought together in urgent meetings. The question was straightforward. How do we resolve this without allowing Caitlin Clark to walk away from the season? How do we prevent a public conflict that could damage the league's entire trajectory? Public relations teams began working on narrative management. If this story went public, and reports suggested it was already beginning to circulate, the league needed to be prepared with messaging. They needed to control how this was presented to the media and the public. They needed to ensure that casual fans understood the situation in a way that didn't damage either Clark or the league's reputation. But here's what made this situation so delicate. Clark had genuine support. Social media was already filling with fans who understood her position. People recognized that Sophie Cunningham had made genuine sacrifices. People understood that loyalty meant something, and people respected the fact that Clark was willing to stand beside her teammate. Commentary from basketball analysts and sports observers highlighted the complexity of the situation. Many noted that Clark had positioned herself in a place where she couldn't be challenged. What was the league going to do? Punish the player who had transformed women's basketball? Force her to continue playing under protest? None of those options were acceptable to league officials concerned about their investment in women's sports. The Fever organization was caught between two impossible positions. They had made a decision about organizational discipline and coaching authority. But they had made it without fully understanding the relational power that had developed between Clark and Cunningham. And now they were facing potential consequences that threatened the entire franchise and the league's future. Reports suggest that conversations were happening at the highest levels of the league. Commissioners, franchise owners, and league executives were all involved in discussions about how to manage this situation. The timeline was critical. They needed to resolve this quickly, before the public conflict became undeniable, and before Clark made good on her threat to walk away. The fundamental reality was this: the WNBA couldn't afford to lose Caitlin Clark. It was that simple. Everything, the growth, the investment, the future of women's basketball, depended on Clark continuing to play. And if that meant reversing Stephanie White's decision about Sophie Cunningham, then that's what would need to happen, regardless of what the coaching staff believed about organizational discipline and control. For the first time, the organization was facing a situation where the coaching staff's authority was being challenged by something more powerful: the star player's leverage and the league's financial dependence on that star player. And everyone involved in those emergency discussions understood that only one outcome was possible. Sophie Cunningham's suspension would have to be reversed, because the alternative, losing Clark, was simply unacceptable. This story has transcended basketball entirely. It's no longer about coaching philosophy or team discipline or tactical decisions made in pursuit of wins. What's allegedly happening inside the Indiana Fever organization has become a test of something far more fundamental: whether loyalty still matters in professional sports, whether athletes should stand beside teammates who sacrifice themselves, and whether organizational authority should supersede human relationships forged through genuine protection and mutual respect. The question facing Indiana now is profound. Will they reverse Sophie Cunningham's suspension and acknowledge that some things matter more than control? Or will they hold firm on principle and risk losing the player who has transformed their franchise and the entire league? But perhaps the real question is for all of us. In a world where loyalty is rare and personal benefit often trumps sacrifice, what does it mean when a superstar chooses to risk everything to protect someone who protected her? What does it say about the kind of person Caitlin Clark is? And what does it reveal about what we genuinely value in athletes and in each other? This isn't finished. The story is still unfolding. The Fever organization is still making decisions. And the future of women's basketball is still being written by the choices these players and leaders make right now. Stay tuned, because everything could change within hours.